No registry number. No routing stamp.
No chain of custody dating back to the original clerk who filed it, because no clerk ever did. It passed through hands the way a secret passes through a family, not spoken, only inherited.
Felt in the silence at dinner.
Carried in the way certain people leave a room when certain names are mentioned.
The Crown has files on everything.
On every diplomat who ever shook the wrong hand at the wrong reception. On every MP whose loyalty wobbled for a single quarter. On whispers that traveled from one palace corridor to another and, arrived, slightly changed, at the ears of people paid to listen.
This file was different. This file was the kind of thing that, if it existed, meant something very old and very patient had been waiting not for an opportunity, but for someone foolish enough to look. Sergeant Daniel Ford was not foolish.
21 years in the household division.
Posted to the palace twice. Never late. Never wrong.
Never the sort of man who opened things that weren't addressed to him. But Princess Charlotte had already opened it. And, by the time Ford found the empty folder on her writing desk, the broken seal still tacky, the red wax still warm, the only question left was not what she'd read. It was whether anyone else already knew she had.
The file had no title. Just a date.
1987, and a name that shouldn't still be dangerous.
It was I know because I log everything.
It is the particular madness I have developed over 21 years of standing in corridors and watching doors, the compulsive, slightly embarrassing habit of noting times the way other men note weather.
1447.
The wax on the writing desk was the color of a fresh bruise and still soft at the edges when I pressed my thumb to it.
Not a professional assessment. Instinct.
The kind your body makes before your rank catches up. The folder was cream-colored.
Palace issue.
The kind that whispers do not rush me just by existing.
It was empty.
I had been posted to the princess's residential wing for 11 days. A lateral reassignment from the outer perimeter, framed as a promotion, the way lateral reassignments always are, with handshakes and careful language about trust and proximity. Lieutenant Commander Ashworth had delivered it himself, which should have told me something. Ashworth never delivers anything himself unless the thing being delivered is too delicate for paper. I had spent 11 days observing Charlotte's routines. 6 a.m. constitutional in the East Garden, 2 protection officers trailing at the regulation distance, close enough to intercept a problem, far enough to maintain the fiction of solitude.
Correspondence between 9 and 11. Lunch alone.
Afternoon engagements, 3 per week, for if Parliament was in session, and then, the long, quiet hours of early evening when the palace exhaled and you could hear, if you stood very still in the right corridor, the specific creak of the third floorboard outside her study.
I had been standing very still. I heard the creak at 14:31. Then, the sound of the study door.
Then, nothing for 16 minutes.
Then, my radio. Ford. Get up there.
The voice was Ashworth's.
Flat.
The flatness of a man who has just been told something and has not yet decided how to feel about it. Her study smelled of paper and something faintly floral, not perfume, something older, the kind of scent that lives in curtain fabric for decades and can't be evicted.
The princess was standing at the window when I came in. Not looking out.
Just standing near it, the way people stand near exits when they are not yet sure they want to leave but want the option close. She was 26. I keep writing that down in my log as though it means something, as though her age explains or complicates what she did.
It doesn't.
It just sits there in my notes, stubborn and irrelevant, next to the time.
Sergeant Ford. She didn't turn. Your Royal Highness. The folder on my desk. Yes, ma'am. I want you to tell me where it came from. I looked at the desk. The folder. The broken seal. The absence of any content inside it, which was, I was already understanding, the most significant thing in the room. I don't know, ma'am. That's interesting. She turned then.
Her face was doing something careful, the specific expression of someone who has decided to be composed while not yet being composed.
Because it was addressed to me. With my full title. In handwriting I recognized. I waited. My father's handwriting.
The king had been in residence at Balmoral since Tuesday. His correspondence traveled through 3 separate offices before it arrived anywhere near this wing. Every piece logged, scanned, cross-referenced against the weekly manifest.
This folder was not on any manifest.
I had checked. Not then, earlier, the morning it had appeared on her desk, when I'd first noticed it during my 8 o'clock sweep and registered something slightly wrong about the way it sat.
Too centered. Too deliberate. Like something placed rather than delivered. I had noted the time. 7:52, discovered. And then, because I am the particular kind of fool who trusts procedure over instinct, I had gone back to my post and waited for the system to catch up with what my gut already knew. The system had not caught up. The princess had. What was inside it, ma'am? She looked at me for a long moment. The kind of look that is deciding something about you, not your competence, that was settled, but your trustworthiness, which is an entirely different register and one that no amount of procedure can establish. Documents, she said. Photographs. A letter. And the content? She turned back to the window. A name. Outside, the afternoon was doing what London afternoons do in November, getting dark too early, apologetically, as though embarrassed by its own haste. The garden lights had come on, those small brass fixtures along the path that I had walked 4 times a day for 11 days without once finding them remarkable. I found them remarkable now. I don't know why. Something about their smallness. The way they stood there, burning away dutifully, lighting paths for people who already knew where they were going. The folder was sealed when you found it on your desk, ma'am? Yes. And the letter, the handwriting, I know my father's hand, Sergeant. Not sharp. Worse than sharp. Patient. I've known it my entire life. I wrote down the time. 15:04. Then, I stood there for a moment with my pen still on the page, trying to determine which part of this I was supposed to report first: the unauthorized entry of correspondence into a secure residential wing, the breach of internal routing protocol, or the fact that a file with no registry number had arrived bearing the king's handwriting and contained, apparently, a name significant enough to make Princess Charlotte stand near an exit and speak very carefully to a man she had known for 11 days. I wrote down, name not yet disclosed. Princess in possession of content. Content now missing from folder. Then, I crossed out missing. Content was not missing. Content was inside her. That was the problem. I radioed Ashworth at 15:09. She opened it, I said. A pause. Long enough to be deliberate. We know, he said. I stood in the corridor outside her study, listening to the creak of the 3rd floorboard under my own weight, and understood, with the particular, settling clarity of a man whose instincts have just caught up to his rank, that we know was not the beginning of his sentence. It was the end of someone else's plan. My radio crackled once. Then, went quiet. I know because I logged it. I log everything, which has become less of a professional habit and more of a private religion, the belief that if I write enough things down, I will eventually look at the page and understand them. He came alone, which was wrong. Ashworth traveled with a second officer the way the palace traveled with ceremony, not because the ceremony did anything, but because its absence would mean something. The absence of his second officer meant something. I noted it. He did not look at me when he entered the study. He looked at the desk. At the folder. At the broken seal, the way a man looks at a thing he expected to find broken and finds no relief in finding it. She's asked for the file source, I said. She won't get it. She already has part of it. Whatever was inside. He turned then. Ashworth was 53, built like someone who had been broader once and carried the memory of it in his posture, shoulders that still held the width even when the muscle had redistributed itself into something quieter. He had 17 years on me and approximately 10,000 more cautions, and he spent them all looking at me now. What did she tell you? Documents. Photographs. A letter. A name she didn't share. She won't share it. You know the name. He didn't answer. Which was the answer?
I had been in enough rooms with enough careful men to know that silence in response to a question is never neutral.
Silence is a decision.
Silence is the moment a person decides the truth is less useful than its absence.
I wrote down the time. Then, I wrote, Ashworth knows the name.
Ashworth expected the seal to be broken. Then, I stopped writing and looked at the page for a moment. Ashworth expected the seal to be broken. There is a protocol for unauthorized correspondence in a royal residential wing. I had read it twice during my reassignment briefing, the dense procedural language that says very clearly, all unregistered materials discovered within secure residential zones are to be immediately flagged, quarantined, and reported via the Level 2 communications channel to the Director of Protective Operations.
The Level 2 channel bypasses standard palace communications. It is encrypted. It does not route through Ashworth's office.
I had not used the Level 2 channel. I had used my radio. I had reported to Ashworth. Which meant, and I was only arriving at this now, standing in a study that smelled of decades-old curtain fabric and Princess Charlotte's particular, unnameable composure, that I had made the exact choice someone had designed the situation to make me make.
The folder on the desk. The broken seal. The unauthorized delivery to a secure wing.
Every element engineered to produce a specific sequence of responses, and, at the end of the sequence, a guard who had called his direct superior before calling the encrypted channel, which meant the encrypted channel had not been used, which meant whatever was in that folder had not been formally logged, which meant it did not exist.
Officially.
It was the cleanest thing I had ever seen. I hated it the way you hate a thing that has outsmarted you so completely that your only response is a kind of exhausted admiration.
Where is she now? Ashworth asked.
East Corridor.
Her personal protection detail.
She needs to be in her rooms.
She declined. He blinked. Once. The precise, restrained blink of a man who has heard something inconvenient. She declined. At 15:17. Politely.
With the specific firmness of someone who has already decided what they're going to do and doesn't require my input on it.
The words came out with more edge than I intended.
Ashworth registered it and filed it away in whatever internal register he kept for subordinates who had begun developing opinions. He would return to it later, probably. I would worry about that later too. Worrying about rank felt like a small and manageable problem given the available alternatives.
What is she going to do? He asked. I don't know.
That's why I said specific firmness and not a plan I was briefed on.
He crossed to the desk. Looked at the folder again.
Picked it up by the corner, careful, 2 fingers, as though it were evidence, which it technically was, except evidence of a crime requires a crime to have been formally registered, and we had established that this folder did not formally exist.
The name in that letter, I said. It's from 1987. He went still.
Not the stillness of surprise. The stillness of a man standing at the edge of something he has been expecting for a very long time and is not sure he is ready for now that it has arrived.
How do you know the date? He said. Because she told me. He turned. This time the look was different. Not assessing my trustworthiness. Something older than that.
Something that had moved past trust entirely into a territory I didn't have a clean word for.
She told you the date, he said. Nothing else. A name she didn't share, a date, and photographs. That's all I have. He set the folder down.
Straightened it on the desk with one finger, that small, involuntary gesture of a person who cannot stop tidying even when the mess is not the kind you can tidy.
The date is enough, he said, quietly. More to himself than to me. I wrote it down.
I found her at 1602, at the far end of the East Corridor, standing at the tall window that looked over the inner courtyard. Her protection detail, 2 officers, Michaels and Ron, were at regulation distance. Doing the job correctly.
Eyes out. Posture neutral. She heard me coming.
I know because her shoulders changed, not stiffened, something more subtle. The adjustment of a person who has been waiting for a specific set of footsteps.
Sergeant Ford. Ma'am. Commander Ashworth has asked. I heard what Commander Ashworth asked.
She was still looking at the courtyard. Down below, the last of the afternoon tourists were filing out through the east gate, their breath visible in the cold, their cameras going. All of them pointing at the building and not at the window.
People never think to look at the windows. The answer is still no. He's concerned about my what? I stopped.
She turned then, and what was on her face was not composure this time. Not the careful architecture of a woman performing her own calm. It was something much simpler, and, therefore much harder to look at. It was the face of someone who had read something they couldn't unread and was now living in the first hours of knowing that specific, nauseating clarity of a secret that has just become yours to carry.
Do you have children, Sergeant?
No, ma'am.
A father?
Yes. And if you found something that made you question, not doubt.
Question.
The entirety of something you'd been taught was true. She stopped.
Looked back at the courtyard. What would you do with that?
I thought about it.
I'd want to know who gave it to me, I said. And, why now?
She was quiet for a moment.
Yes, she said.
That's the right question, isn't it?
Below us, the east gate closed. The last tourist went through.
One of the Queen's Guard at the gate rotated his position, the slow, practiced pivot of a man who has performed the same movement so many times it has become something between muscle memory and prayer.
I logged the time.
The princess did not go back to her rooms, not Ashworth's office.
Not the director of protective operations.
Not any of the 3 escalation channels I had been briefed on during reassignment. The king's private secretary, a man named Gideon Wells, whom I had met exactly once, at a transition briefing 18 months ago, who had the particular manner of someone who had spent so many years in the proximity of consequence that he had become, himself, a kind of consequence, called my personal radio. My personal radio, which was a closed channel registered only to my detail, Ashworth's office, and the residential wing's internal network. I stood in the east corridor and stared at the display.
Gideon Wells. I logged the time. Then, I answered. Sergeant Ford.
His voice was the kind of voice that had never once in its life been uncertain of the room it was in.
I understand you've had an interesting afternoon.
Yes, sir. And, I understand the princess is currently in the east corridor and has declined twice to return to her rooms.
Correct. Good, he said. I wrote that down. Good. Underlined it. Stood very still. Sir?
We needed her to stay in the corridor, Sergeant. We needed her in a location where a level 1 protection unit could reach her within 4 minutes from the northern approach.
He paused. We also needed Ashworth occupied with the study.
The corridor was very quiet. Michael's and Ran were 30 feet away, facing out.
Princess Charlotte was still at the window. The winter dark had come fully now, London doing its November thing, and the courtyard below was lit by those small brass path fixtures, burning away in their dutiful, pointless rows. I thought about everything I had logged since 7:52 that morning. Thought about the folder placed too precisely on the desk. Thought about Ashworth arriving alone. Thought about the level 2 channel I hadn't used, and whether my failure to use it had been a failure at all, or whether someone had needed me to make exactly that choice. Thought about a princess standing near an exit for 45 minutes, asking questions about fathers. The file was bait, I said. The file was a key, Wells said. There's a difference. There is a kind of anger that is not heat but cold. I had felt it 3 times in my career. Once when I was 29 and a superior officer falsified a report that cost a good man his posting. Once when I was 38 and watched a diplomatic protection detail dissolve over paperwork that had been deliberately misrouted. And, now, at 44, standing in a corridor in the oldest working palace in Europe, understanding that I had been a variable in someone's equation and had performed exactly as calculated. The anger was clean. Familiar. I reached for it the way you reach for a tool you know fits your hand. Who is the name in the letter? I said. Wells took a breath. Just one. That's above your clearance, Sergeant. I'm standing 40 feet from the princess, who has been read in on it. The princess is above your clearance. Sir. With respect. Someone used me to isolate Commander Ashworth from this corridor for approximately 90 minutes. I'd like to know what that 90 minutes was for. Another pause. Longer this time. A meeting, he said. That has since concluded. With whom? With people who needed to confirm that the file had been received and understood. His voice remained level. Not unkind. The tone of a man explaining something he finds mildly regrettable, the way a surgeon might explain a scar. The princess's reaction was necessary to verify. Grief reads differently than performance, Sergeant. Even royals are not immune to the distinction. I looked at Charlotte. At her back. At the specific set of her shoulders that had not changed since she'd read whatever was in that letter, still carrying it, the weight distributed so evenly you might not notice if you didn't know what you were looking for. You watched her. We assessed her. She didn't know. No. And, if she'd gone back to her rooms when Ashworth asked. If she'd been composed enough to perform normalcy. We would have drawn a different conclusion about the file's contents, Wells said. And, taken different steps accordingly. I did not ask what the different steps would have been. Some questions are the kind your rank protects you from having to carry. I had been in enough corridors and enough rooms to know when a door was being held open for me and when it was being quietly closed. This was the closing. At 1800 hours, 2 protection officers I had never seen, no insignia I recognized, carrying themselves with the particular economy of people trained somewhere older than the division, came through the northern approach and took positions at each end of the corridor. Michaels and Wren were rotated out without word. I was not rotated out. I stood at my post and logged the change. Logged the time. Logged the new positions. Tried to determine what category of situation required a protection unit with no visible insignia and a 4-minute response window from the northern approach, and could not find a category that was comfortable. Charlotte turned from the window at 1807. She looked at the 2 officers. Then, at me. The file, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. They used it to watch me. I believe so, ma'am. She was quiet. Her face did something then, that I will not pretend I have the language for, something that moved through it like a stone through water, fast and gone, leaving the surface changed in ways you couldn't precisely measure. And, my father's handwriting. I don't know, ma'am. You mean you're not allowed to know? I said nothing. Which was the answer. She understood it as such. She looked out at the courtyard one more time. At the little brass lights. At the dark garden beyond them. He signed it, she said. The letter. His full signature. She said it very simply, the way you say a thing when you've been turning it in your hands for hours and have worn off all the initial shock and are left with just the fact of it, smooth-edged and permanent. Whatever is in that file, whatever that name means, my father signed the letter himself. He wanted me to have it. She walked back toward her rooms. The 2 unfamiliar officers adjusted their positions. Everything precise. Everything choreographed. At the door to her wing, she stopped. Sergeant Ford. Ma'am. Keep logging, she said. I have written 3 things in my log since she went inside. The time, 1814. The date of the file, 1987. And 1 question that I wrote and then stared at for a long time before deciding to leave on the page, because some questions need to exist somewhere, even if no one reads them. If the king wanted her to have the file, who wanted her watched while she opened it? The corridor is quiet. The brass lights are still burning in the courtyard below. I am still at my post.